Hello and welcome to my part 4 in our naming series where we talk about naming different compounds. Now today we're going to move on to some new rules, and I have put all of the rules that we will learn or have learned so far in this series. Now this series won't cover all of the naming rules, so the rules that we won't go over, for example, are things like naming acids. That will be in different videos. We're going to focus on naming binary covalent molecular compounds and binary ionic compounds. Today we're going to focus on this first upper half. Now you might notice some things that are different about this upper half compared to the lower one. Instead of cations and anions, we have first atom and second atom. Now, in this case, we are going to be using prefixes. That's probably the biggest difference between naming the lower ones, the ionic compounds, and these. Prefixes are going to go before the element name or before that root plus IDE step that we normally do. Now, the prefixes I'll show in a second. They're not anything super complicated, and some of these prefixes we might know already. I've taken away the ionic compound naming rules. We're going to focus now on the new prefixes that we haven't really used before. Now, some of these might seem familiar. We have mono for 1, di for 2, tri for 3, tetra for 4, penta 5, hexa 6, hepta 7, octa 8, nona 9, and deca 10. Now in this case, some of these might seem a little bit familiar. So a tricycle has 3 wheels, a pentagon has 5 sides, and an octopus has 8 legs. We see these prefixes and different words that we might have used in our day-to-day life. Now, we have a couple of exceptions to the prefixes. The first one is going to be that if we only have one atom for the first atom, we actually don't use a prefix. So the prefix is only if you have more than one atom for the first one. So you'll never see mono as our starting prefix for our first atom. We just drop it if it's 1. We will see di, tri, tetra, and so forth. These are all acceptable for the first atom. Now for the second atom, you can have any of those. We can have mono. It doesn't matter how many we have for the second atom. Every single time it gets the prefix. Now let's go through some naming rules. I won't include the prefixes on these next slides just for space, so it would be a good time to either write these down or copy these down so you have them as we go through these practice problems. Our first example is PF3. Now let's go to the periodic table and find our 2 elements. Our first element is phosphorus, right here, and our second element is fluorine, which is right here. Now let's look at our rules. It says first atom and then prefix if more than one atom. Now over here, we see that it just says P. Now that means that there's just one phosphorus. We don't write a number. If it's 1, it's an implied 1, so there is just one phosphorus here. We do not need a prefix for this one. We can just write the element name. So we would have phosphorus, and then we need to go and look at what our fluorine is. Now we'll need a prefix for this one. The prefix for 3 is tri, so we get tri. And then fluorine, we need to switch it. We need to switch it into what our second atom's ending would be. So fluorine, we take off the ending and then we add IDE, just like with the ionic naming rules. So this becomes trifluoride. Our full name for PF3 is phosphorus trifluoride. Now let's try another one. We have N2O3. Well, now our first atom does have more than one atom. We see here that it says N2. There are 2 nitrogens here. Now, in this case, our prefix for this one will be di. So we put Di. Now for our first atom, we don't actually change the element name. We're just going to write nitrogen, and this is one word. So dinitrogen is one word in this. So we have dinitrogen. That's the first half. Our second half, we do our prefix, and let's look. Our O is oxygen, and it has 3. So there are 3 oxygens. We're going to put our prefix for 3, and we used this on the previous one. It's tri. And now, just like before, we take our element name, which is oxygen. We take off the ending and add IDE. So doing this step, which is very similar to ionic naming rules, oxygen becomes oxide. Our full name for this is dinitrogen trioxide. We have some new elements here. We have S and N. Now we used N in one of our previous examples. That one's nitrogen. And our S is going to be sulfur here. We're going to name the first atom first. Now in this case, there are 4 sulfurs. We see that over here with this subscript of 4. That means we need the prefix for 4. This one we haven't used yet. This one is called tetra. So I'm going to write tetra. Now this is all one word. So tetra plus the element name, that is all one word. So our first word is tetrasulfur. We don't change anything about the element name for the first one. Our first word is tetrasulfur. We're going to do a space, and now we're moving on to our second atom. Our second atom always gets a prefix, and in this case there are 2 nitrogens. That means our prefix will be di. And again, this is one word, so di, nitrogen becomes nitride, so this is dinitride, one word. So when you see these names, these are 2-word names. Our first word in this case is tetrasulfur, our second word is dinitride. Now, when we see these names, it does give us an idea of our subscripts, unlike the ionic compounds where we don't have any indication of how many of each cation and anion ionic compounds. Covalent molecular compounds are much easier for us to go the other way on, which we'll see in a later video. And here we have our last example. We have P2O5. Now, our first atom is phosphorus. We've used this element before. Our second atom is oxygen. Or our second element is oxygen. For our phosphorus, we have 2 phosphorus atoms and we have 5 oxygen atoms. Now, in this case, we're going to name our first atom first, and we're going to need to use a prefix for this one, and the prefix for 2 is di. This becomes diphosphorus, and this is going to be one word. So diphosphorus is one word. Now we're going to do a space and deal with our second atom. Now, this one will be, I'm going to point out something that's small that we'll have to do for this one. Now, we're going to use our prefix, and our prefix for 5 is penta. And then we take our oxygen, we take off the ending, and add our IDE. So oxygen becomes oxide. Now, if we leave it like this, we have diphosphorus pentaoxide. As you go through these examples, this should give you a good idea of how to use these naming rules, and you can use these as practice to help become more comfortable with how to name these types of example naming problems. Good luck studying.